Hey everybody, so one of the biggest complaints about Power Pages over the years has been the issue of caching. What is caching? Well, basically, if you update something in Dataverse, it can take anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes in order for it to appear on your Power Pages website. So in most cases, this isn't too much of an issue, but in some cases, it is an issue when you're doing things like maybe calculating tax. Maybe you have a process on your Dataverse side that's creating child records, and you want that to be reflected on the portal. So if I look at my particular website here, I have a bunch of sessions here. That's great. And I want to add a brand new session, and I want it to appear immediately on the Power Pages website. Going into my model-driven app, I filled in my session information. Let's fill in stuff like the start time and end time and all this stuff. That looks great. The duration will be about an hour. And I'm going to save and close this record. So this is saving to Dataverse on my model-driven app on the kind of client side. Now, if I were to go look at my portal and I would hit refresh, meaning I'm just refreshing my browser, it doesn't show up. Where did it go? Is it being added? What's going on? So what's happening is it is in Dataverse, but due to the Power Pages caching, it's not showing up there yet. So what we could do is we could wait 15 minutes and it will show up. There's a few other methods. I could manipulate the fetch XML to use the modified date. That's a hack. I've also blogged about other hacks about using the web API to write a record back from the portal to Dataverse, which would trigger it. So basically, if I was to update anything on Power Pages, that would actually update Dataverse. That would be shown. But anyways, this is still an issue until now. So what I have done is I've created a custom page, and I'm using something called a new feature called server logic. And we actually see this is a custom table, but we see immediately that this information showed up into the table, which is pretty cool. It actually skipped the cache. Now, this is a new thing. It is in preview currently, so I could say it's supported, but it's maybe not supported yet because it's not yet general availability, but it is an official way to get around the cache. Now, this is something that should be used extremely sparingly because it is going to be a performance hit because it is going to go back to the system to retrieve Dataverse data. And we don't want the system going back and forth because that could really slow your Power Pages site down. However, there are certain situations where you're going to want to skip the cache. So how do we do this? All right, so first off, I'm going to go into the Design Studio. And if we go into the Setup Workspace, we see that we have a new feature here called Server Logic. And I've already created a new server logic here, but I just would go through, I would give it a name. You can call it whatever you want. You give it a display name and a description. And then you also have to specify the Power Pages web roles who will be allowed to see this. So let's take a look at the one I created earlier. I'm just going to edit this. I just call it Dataverse CRUD Operations. I basically took the code from the MS Learn site and put it in here. Now, if you've looked at server logic, it does create a lot of other things. We can do Dataverse create, read, update, delete. We can also call external APIs, but doing it on the server side, so we don't have to worry about a lot of those security concerns, a lot of that extra code, or even creating something like Azure companion apps, that type of thing. We were able to call that within the server side itself. So I've called this basically Dataverse CRUD Operations, which, like I said, is using the code from MS Learn. If you go with the companion blog post, you will see the code there. Didn't really give it a display name or description, probably should do that. And I've added the roles authenticated users for now. All well and good. We're saving this. And now the other thing I can do is I can select this and let's take a look at the code itself. Now, I'm opening this up in Visual Studio Code for the web, but you could actually edit this in the desktop version. I did notice a bug. I have talked to Microsoft about that, but that's sort of another topic. Basically, we're just looking at that code and see here we have a bunch of different functions. We have our get function, or post functions, or put functions, and all this. Let's just focus on the get function because basically if I take a look here, we have the server.connector.dataverse retrieve multiple records. That's what we're doing to retrieve our data. We have the entity set name, the additional parameters, and we have this other parameter, skip cache. That's the money maker right there. If we set this to true, that is going to skip the cache in retrieving the records, which is pretty awesome. So we have this, basically this server-side code. It is going to be running on the server. We're not going to be able to browse or look at that through our browser. That's all good. If we want to debug it, there are some ways we can do debugging. Here's the server logger, so I can actually use the Power Pages dev tools to take a look at that. That's really cool. All right, so let's dive into some of the other code. So the other thing that I've done is basically I've created a web template. Now I've broken up the code that you saw in MS Learn into some different modules. First off, I basically moved all the theming for this particular table into a CSS file, keeping all that separate. It's always a good practice to keep your CSS information in its own separate file. And I know my designer friends out there are always screaming at me about using the styling tags in my regular HTML. So I have broken that out. Let's take also a look at the other templates. I've created a helper file. And again, you can take a look at my blog post, but basically I've broken out that we still need a CSRF token in order to wrap these requests. I've put that in its own file, very much like if I was using the web API, I would break that out. And I put that in that helper file because this is something I'm going to be reusing again and again throughout my code. So again, write once, refer to it often. That's kind of one of the development things. So this is pretty much just cut and paste from MS Learn, from the tutorial. So definitely check those out, go through them. And then I also created my other code here. And this is another template. One thing I do like doing is creating manifest. And with manifest, that means I can create a web template, but create it as a component. And I can give that to my makers, and my makers can use the Design Studio and put that on a web page very easily without having to break into the code and that type of thing. So we have that there. I basically have a data table, and then I'm basically going through the function to build my HTML table. I am going my Ajax call, which is calling that helper file, and I have my get here, and the URL again is going through that API through the Dataverse CRUD operations. That's the server-side code I created. I'm passing it parameters, the entity set name, which is the name of the table. Of course, it's pluralized, remember that. And my additional parameters, of course, selecting the session name and the session description. And then I'm also doing the skip cache equals true. I'm basically passing that as a parameter so I can turn that off or on. Again, we want to use that very sparingly. So I'm basically calling that function, and through that, it's going to display that on the page. So I've created all my code here. If I now go back into my Design Studio, and what I can do here is I actually created a page already in my server logic. I protected it behind a web role, but really all it really basically is I'm going through, and now I can add this events, which is that web template as a component. I can basically just place that on my page here. Let me just get rid of this one for now. Let's delete that one. So we have this here, and then of course, it being a custom component, we can put in other parameters. So for here, I'm just going to put in test. That's all good. And we have that parameter here. It's great. We have that component in here, which has some code behind it, which is calling my server-side code, which is basically pulling data from Dataverse and using that skip cache. So I would just basically preview this. So we have a list of all of these things. And now, interesting thing I can do, I can create new things. I can manipulate all this. Here in my model-driven app, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select one of these items here, and I'm just going to delete it. Yeah, I did select it. There we go. Let's delete it. Now this delete is happening directly in Dataverse. There's deleted. Now I'm not going through, I'm not refreshing the cache. I'm not going to the clear cache page. And I'm literally just doing a regular browser refresh. And we see here that record got deleted completely because it is going back out to Dataverse. It is retrieving that data. It's using the skip cache, so it's getting fresh data through here. This is pretty cool to me in terms of Power Pages development. This gets rid of a big roadblock that a lot of developers have run into over the years of how to get around the cache for those edge cases. Again, use this very sparingly. Definitely check out the companion blog where I've got all the code and kind of broke out how I built that all out. If you like this, love to hear on how you're now skipping the cache and the use cases for it. Looking forward to the next video.